All right, so welcome again. This is the Road to November community conversation, navigating difficult conversations with Marinelle Reynolds. Welcome, thank you for being here, Marinelle. I have Marinelle's bio, I'm just flipping screens, give me 1 second. My computer is being very slow. It's a Monday and technology is working slowly.
Right. It's not ready for the week yet.
It is not. Everybody seems to be having tech problems. All right, let's see what I got here. Here we go. Well, thank you. So let's try this again. So I'm here with Marinelle Reynolds, MSW, LCSW. Marinelle is a private practice owner who specializes in working with high-achieving people pleasers to their middle path so that they can integrate what they know in their heads with what they feel in their hearts. Her mission is to empower people to know in their knower that they are both a masterpiece and a work of art in progress. She's dedicated to inspiring people to live aligned with their unique values, passions, and purpose. So, Marinelle, thank you very much for joining us today. And we're really excited for this timely and important conversation right now. So I'm going to turn things over to you. And it looks like Jennifer's been able to join us. Hopefully you all can see her. Hi, Jen.
Can you hear me? That's always the million-dollar question.
I can hear you. All right. Marinelle?
Yay for technology working.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jeff and Marinelle. Thank you for joining us, but also hanging in while I navigated Monday morning Zoom challenges.
Of course, you got to roll with things, right? It's like typical 2020 right now. If there's a hiccup, it's going to happen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this important conversation. You know, right now there are many challenging conversations that we are having with our friends, with our families, and this is an important conversation and tools that we can hopefully give to people as we approach certainly November, but also the holiday season and just a time where families are really starting to come together and maybe haven't been together in quite some time. Well, since March.
Yes. For sure. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to have this conversation with y'all. I'm really I'm privileged and very honored to be part of this discussion with everyone. And thank you so much for the introduction. So, you know, I've worked in this field for the last 20 years, like working with individuals and groups and communities, both within the private and nonprofit and government sectors. And so I'm really excited to be here with you guys to talk through how to navigate difficult conversations. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. And as we go through this discussion, I really want it to be an interactive experience for everybody. So if you would like, you could pop in questions in the chat or in Facebook, and Jen and Jeff will make sure that I hear and see the questions. While I'm sharing my screen, if you need to grab a pen and a notebook, grab a pen and notebook, or if you're like me and you have multiple beverages, grab your beverages and we'll sit down and have a chit chat. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. And then just let me know that it is showing up on your end. So let's get started.
Yeah, we see your slides.
Perfect. So Theodore Roosevelt said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly." So this is a quote that a lot of us, especially for social workers, know from Brene Brown's work, or maybe if you're a basketball fan, know from LeBron James's shoes. But in his speech, Citizens of the Republic, President Theodore Roosevelt spoke at the Sorbonne at the Grand Amphitheater at the University of Paris. And he firmly believed that a person learned best by doing. And he argued and felt strongly that it was a leader's responsibility to be in the arena with his people. And he argued that it's better to try and to stumble than to do nothing at all, and worse, criticize those that were in the arena. And so I don't know about you, but right now I feel very much like I'm in an arena. And as someone who is also a recovering high for performing people pleaser who's really uncomfortable with conflict, I'm having all sorts of feels about the discussions that are going on and the polarization in our country right now. And so I did what I do when I'm feeling powerless or when I feel like I'm not sure what to do. I turn to my roots as a social worker and I turn to research. And so what I did was I turned to research and best practices across disciplines. I looked at research and best practice within our field of social work, of psychology, sociology, ethics, law, economics, neuropsychology, and business. And I hope that today, with me sharing what I've learned in this process, helps you also show up in the arena with us, because your voice matters, what you have to say matters. So in order for us to frame this conversation, I've organized it into three main categories. So first is our intrapersonal skills, the inner work that we need to do to build our capacity for more positive interactions with other people and across groups. The second part is really looking at our interpersonal skills, which focuses on communication within our relationships. And then also took some time to take a look at intergroup skills. So the skills that we use to bring people together or bring groups together. And all of these skills are really relevant to us, especially if we're leaders in the community or maybe people a part of relationships, because this can help us really guide us towards better interactions and deeper understanding of one another. Before we can do the deep work of having these conversations and having these sometimes difficult conversations, it's really important for us to foster a safe place to have these talks, to discuss what's really important. So it's important that we establish agreements on what's okay and what's not okay. And in the chat, I want you to write down, what do you think are things that are going to get in the way of you showing up to do this work? And what do you think you need in order for you to be able to show up? And so I really encourage us to come from a place of curiosity and help us suspend judgment, really practice listening to understand and not listening to reply. And as we go through our talk today, noting common ground as well as acknowledging differences. And I want to encourage you guys to be authentic as well as welcoming authenticity from other people. And I hope that in our conversation, we're purposeful so that we can take our insights into action. So in the chat, if you could just point out or like pop in really quick, what are some things that you need to give yourself permission for, or what are some things when we're having this conversation, do you think that is really important for us to have a safe place to have these talks? And I'll let you guys post those as those come in. Let's see. Do you guys see the chat when I pull the chat box up or when I share the screen?
I think everybody does. They might be just listening as well.
Okay,
so
perfect.
if you want to chat in the chat box, you're welcome to. Also, if you want to raise your virtual hand, you can do so, and I'm happy to come online and mute you as well.
Perfect. So I see Alex says, hello, Alex, that points out that it's important to have an open mind and not to take things personal. That's a really good call out. And we'll actually go in our talk today to understand why it's so hard not to take things personal, especially when we're having really deep and difficult discussions around politics. So if you have more ideas or suggestions about our conversation agreements, go ahead and pop up in the chat. If not, I'm just going to kind of move on. So our first pillar is really looking at our intrapersonal skills, so that deep inner work, and it's really about building self-awareness and controlling our own internal attitudes and our inner processes. Because our intrapersonal skills, the inner work, is really what forms the foundation on how we show up in our relationships. They help us navigate our relationships. They influence like the things that we say and how we behave in our relationships. So that's why we start with the intrapersonal work. We start with looking inward. And if we're looking inward, it's really important for us to understand what our values are. And I really wanted to, because I'm talking to a lot of social workers, to really ground us on our social workers' code of ethics. So in the preamble of our code of ethics for social work, the primary mission for social work and the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and to help meet the basic needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. And a historic and defining feature of social work is the profession's focus on individual well-being in a social context and the well-being of our society. So fundamental to social work is attention to the environmental forces that create and contribute and address problems in living. This work isn't just about bridging people together. It's also about striving to end discrimination, oppression, poverty, and other forms of social injustice. As social workers, we can disagree on how we do this, but we cannot disagree on if we do this. The mission of social work and our profession is really rooted in core values. It's rooted in the core values of service and social justice, of dignity and worth of a person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. And these core values flow into the principles and how we show up in our relationships. And we have to balance that within the context and complexity of the human experience. And it's important to point out that within our code of ethics, it doesn't say that one is more important than other. All of these core values is important. So we frame how we show up in our relationships and how we show up with the people that we work with and the people that we work for, with these core values in mind. And it's also important to understand that our own personal core values will also be brought into how we view our professional core values, and how our professional core values influence our personal core values. We can't separate these values from how we connect with other people or how we show up in our relationships. So it's really important for us to take a look with curiosity about what our values are. And so in the chat, or if you're watching this on the replay, or if you're watching this in Facebook, I really want us to lean in with curiosity. And if you feel comfortable, share in the chat or on Facebook. What sense of purpose or mission or duty guides you in your life? What parts of what makes you you are those that have been assigned to you or given to you by your family or by your community? And what parts are those that you've chosen for yourself? What messages did you grow up with in your family about differences and how we approach differences or avoid differences across how people look or how people believe or faith? And ask yourself, do you believe that people really are doing the best that they can? And why or why not? And how do these values, how do these things shape your relationships? How does it shape how you show up in the world around you? Your relationships with your clients, your relationships with your colleagues, your friends and family? How does it influence how you interact with the community? So if you're feeling brave, go ahead and pop it in the chat and share what is something that drives you in your life? What sense of purpose or identity, or even just sharing how your core values influence your relationships? While we're waiting for folks to chat, I'll kind of move on to the next thing. It's important for us to understand our values and how they influence, because they will influence what we do within the relationships. So we have heard over and over again, many times, that we need to be more humble. We need to be more empathetic and less judgmental. But why is it so hard for us? And why is it so difficult for most people to act on those insights? Why is it so hard for us to apply them, especially during an argument with friends and family? And it can be even harder if we're interacting with people who are more distant than us. Well, our brains respond in two very distinct ways. So in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, psychologist and economist Daniel Kahneman, I highly recommend that book, describes that we have two brain systems. We have system one, which is more of our fast, autonomic, intuitive kind of thinking brain. And then we have system two, which is more of our slow, language-based, more reason thinking part of our brain. And these two systems dictate much of our perception and our reactions in life. We often think that it's our slow brain, our more rational brain, that's the one in charge. But if we think about it, it's actually our fast thinking system that dominates a lot of our actions, because our brain leans towards, and our body leans towards efficiency, and it takes a lot of energy to think, and it's a lot slower to think through things rather than kind of react to things impulsively. So our brain really leans towards the system one, the fast thinking, and it dictates what we do. We also struggle with confirmation bias. We don't actually see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. We see the world through our lens, and we're really much more likely to come to conclusions that we've already favored to believe, that we already believe. This is why really difficult conversations and arguments can show up and end up in really frustrating experiences, because no matter how good your reason is, or no matter how logical your argument is, your opponent is not changing their mind. And of course, they're thinking the same thing about you. Both of you are engaging in what's called motivated reasoning. Both of you are really searching for evidence to confirm what you already believe. So before we can get into handling difficult conversations, we really need to do the deep interpersonal work to have understanding about what our values are, and understanding how those values shape much of what our fast thinking brains do. And that also influences our cognitive biases and our motivated reasoning. In the chat, there was, when we're talking about values, someone points out that humanity, spirituality, and equality have been taught, and they're things that we choose to believe. Those are really important to keep in mind on how we view each of those different perspectives. So when we think about our deep inner work, it's also important for us to understand that we also have this very unfortunate tendency to see the world as a battle between the good, which is our side, and the evil, which is the other side, when it comes to political and moral disputes especially. And when we think about morality, morality is difficult. And Jonathan Haidt is a professor of social psychology at the University of Virginia. And he writes in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. He says that morality binds people together into teams that seek out victory, not truth. It closes our hearts and our minds to opponents, even if that means that that's what we need to make cooperation and decency possible within groups. He also has a really great TED Talk that's talking about the moral roots of liberalism and conservatism. That is really interesting. So he argues that human morality is the result of biological and cultural evolutionary process, and that makes human beings really sensitive to many different and often competing issues. Some of these issues are about treating other people and individuals well, like looking at harm versus care, also looking at equality and equity versus fairness and injustice. Other issues are about and around autonomy and the importance of individuality, as well as desires and what defines a good member or group behavior, good group behavior, such as social order or tradition, which are the last three foundations of morality, which is loyalty, authority, and purity. And Haidt and his colleague have found in their research that political liberals, or folks that lean more towards from the middle to the left, generally place a really high value on the first two foundations. They're very concerned about issues of harm and fairness, including issues of inequality and exploitation. And political conservatives, folks that lean more towards the middle to right, care about harm and fairness too, but they generally score lesser or slightly lower on those scale items. The big difference between liberals and conservatives seems to be that the conservatives tend to score slightly higher on the in-group or loyalty foundations and much higher on authority and respect and purity or sanctity foundations. The purity foundation is something really important to point out too, because purity is not just a discussion about sexuality. We can also have a discussion around purity and our views around purity in regards to food. If we're looking at some recent trends, we've actually assigned a lot of morality around good food and bad foods and what's considered pure or unclean. So when we think about purity, it's not really just coming from the lens of sexuality. The interesting thing in regards to like the moral roots of political parties is that when we're confronted or challenged against these moral issues, we will tend to make assumptions about the other person, especially if we're challenged, our beliefs are challenged, and it goes against what we believe very strongly. When we're confronted or challenged, we'll default to thinking that other person is maybe ignorant or maybe they're an idiot. And if we can prove or we find that they're not ignorant or they're not an idiot, then they must be evil, right? Like there's something inherently like morally wrong with them. So the polarization within politics has really become this moral battle where we see ourselves as the rebel alliance fighting against the empire. The thing is when our beliefs are attacked, our brain experiences as a physical attack. Our brain can't tell the difference between a moral attack or an ideological attack and an actual physical attack. We go into our fight, flight, or freeze mode. So this attachment to being right is a protective function, but that attachment to being right also keeps us and it prevents us from making mistakes again in the future. It also keeps us from finding solutions. But more importantly, this attachment to being right dehumanizes the other person, which goes directly against one of our core values as social workers, which is honoring the dignity and worth of the person and the importance of human relationships. So if we end up in this place of threat, it's important for us to understand our neuropsychology or how our brain works, because when we're in a place of threat, our nervous system responds. Our nervous system responds with like our heart increasing, our breathing increasing. And we also, when we're in a place of threat, the muscles in our ears literally are dampened down. Like we literally cannot hear what the other person is saying. And it makes it really hard for us to come up with solutions or learning. But we have our system of safety, which is normally our set point, because as humans, we're really wired to connect. We care about connection. We want to create belonging. Belonging is really important for us. And when we're in our place of safety, our heart rate is calm, our breathing is calm, we're creative, we can come up with innovative solutions. And because we are more likely to experience difficult and challenging political discussions as moral attacks, we will experience it as threat. So we need to get into a place of safety before, during, and after these charged conversations. And I'm going to walk you guys through 2 skills that you can use to prep for these conversations. So this first skill I'm going to show you is a skill that you can use at any point. And this skill taps into our neuropsychology, like and how our brain is wired. It's a way for us to kind of biohack our system into believing that we're in a sense of safety. And this comes from the practice or the modality of RODBT, which is radically open dialectical behavior therapy. And it's called Big 3+1. And this is a way for us to trick our body into believing that we're in a place of safety. And so what we do is that we take a big belly breath, and it's kind of like a tactical breathing or box breathing, where we breathe in deeply through our belly, and we take a deep breath in to the count of 4, and then we breathe out slowly to a count of 4. And what that deep breath does is it innervates our vagal nerve, which down regulates our heart rate and down regulates our breathing. So it slows it down. If you find that you're underactivated in a conversation, then you need to increase the breathing pace a bit, because it's the actual exhale, the slow exhale, that slows our heart rate. But if we breathe quickly, it increases. So if we have a tendency to kind of go into shutdown mode when there's a conflict, then we need to kind of rev ourselves up to get to a place of safety. So Big 3+1 is essentially taking a big deep breath, and then we lean back in our chair. We lift our eyebrows and smile with our eyes and do a closed mouth smile. And I'll walk through this here in a minute, but the lean back in the chair signals to the other person that we're interacting with that there is not a threat. So leaning back, think about how you sit with your friends when you guys are just chilling, when you're having coffee, you're like lean back, right? When there's a threat, if we're feeling activated, right, we will sit, our posture comes up, we're like kind of prepared to like either take off and run, or we're like prepared to fight, right? So our body responds, it happens instinctually. So purposefully leaning back sends the signal to the other person that it's chilled. It also sends a signal to our brain. Now, the eyebrow lift and the smile with your eyes is interesting because from a mirror neuron standpoint, okay, I can get super nerdy about our brain, so I'm going to try not to get get into the details of the neuroscience of it. But the eyebrow raise and the smile with the eyes signals to the other person. It's a common, a cross-cultural signal of friendliness. Like our eyes, we can tell if someone's faking a smile by whether or not the eyes are smiling. It's like it's paying attention that we're not doing the Pan Am smile where like it's very a frozen face and there's kind of a fake smile and you don't really connect with the eyes. So the eyebrow lift actually lifts the side of your eyes to initiate a smile. And that smile actually initiates a part of our optical or our eyes that's connected to the brain that signals friendliness. We also have things called mirror neurons. So it's kind of like the vibe you get from other people, right? Like we can pick up when somebody's feeling anxious or when somebody's feeling angry, and we'll like feel that emotion. It's because as humans, we're wired to connect, and that facial connection, that facial recognition, the signals that we send actually is one of the skills that we use to tap into empathy. And they're mirror neurons. Research shows that if you see someone, and you think about a really sad commercial or like a movie that you're watching, if someone's grimacing in pain, we'll have a tendency to micro grimace. We'll also react to that experience. So it's important to understand that, because just like someone's tension or someone's anxiety or someone's fear is contagious, right? We can see that in social media. If there's a lot of uproar, we feel that tension. But just like tension is contagious, calm is also contagious. And so we want to tap into our neurophysiology so that we're exhibiting a calm connection. So we feel it, but also we're helping the other person in the interaction also feel calm. So before the interaction, we take a big deep breath in, and then we take a slow breath out, and then we sit back and we raise our eyebrows and smile. And what that does is it gets us into a place where we can tap into compassion, where we can tap in both to compassion for ourselves, but also compassion towards others, which leads me to the next skill, which is the loving kindness meditation. So a loving kindness meditation is something that a lot of you probably are already familiar with, especially if you've done any kind of mindfulness practices. But loving kindness meditation, one, helps us from a neuro standpoint to pull us into safety and to downregulate our nervous system, but also it helps us connect to that drive to belong, the need for connection. And it reminds us that we are not alone, that we're all kind of interconnected as humans. And what we do with loving kindness, we do this, I would recommend doing this before going into an interaction to help keep you in a place of safety. And how we do this, and this is a really quick loving kindness meditation. There's a ton online that you can look up, but what I would encourage you to do is just do a big 3+1 and then put your hand over your heart. And if you're here with me, I encourage you to put your hand over your heart. We're going to walk through a loving kindness meditation. And what I imagine is filling myself with this kind of warm light and extending it both to myself and sharing it with others. And I imagine myself kind of like a Care Bear doing the Care Bear stare, right? So I want us to just take a deep breath in, and we say quietly to ourselves, may I be at ease. May I be content with my life. May I experience joy. And may I feel safe and secure. And then we extend that same loving kindness towards the other person. And we say, may you be at ease. May you be content with your life. May you experience joy. May you feel safe and secure. And then because we're interconnected as humans, and we take a space of understanding that we're both here and we're both important, we say to ourselves and extend to ourselves and to others, may we be at peace. May we be content with our life. May we experience joy. And may we feel safe and secure. So I encourage you to practice loving kindness meditation. And this is something also that you can do after the interaction to help connect back to that place of compassion. Remember, compassion is really understanding and connecting to the feeling and seeing suffering in someone else, acknowledging suffering in ourselves and acknowledging suffering in another person, and then doing something to alleviate that suffering. So you can practice loving kindness after the interaction. If you find yourself really activated in the conversation, then sometimes putting distance from the other person is what you need in order to get into a place of safety. So we can change the conversation or redirect it to something that's not as activating. So like if you're sitting at the table for Thanksgiving talking about bread, right? Or if you're doing a Zoom meeting, it's like, hey, what kind of coffee are you drinking, right? So something that's not supercharged. Or it could mean that you have to actually take a step away. So you need to create physical distance so that you can downregulate your nervous system. So the next one we're going to talk about our interpersonal skills. If you have questions about the intrapersonal skills or inner work, you can go ahead and pop them in the chat and I will answer them as we go along. And we don't need to wait till the end of the conversation. We can talk about it as the questions come up. So This comes from RODBT as well, and it's a skill called flexible mind rock on. And this is not necessarily what you say in the interaction, but kind of the stance you take in these interpersonal reactions. And what this is really taking a look and they're really big on acronyms, which I love because it makes it easy for me to remember. So R means we resist the urge to control other people. We identify our goal and our degree of openness. We clarify the priority. We practice kindness first. And we take into account the other person's needs. So when I say kindness first, I want you to like include in the chat or maybe in Facebook, what do you think about when you think about the word kindness, especially if we're having discussions with people who have very different views than us? And so while you're chatting on that, I'll dig in a bit more about this particular skill. So when it comes to relationships, control is a lot like plutonium. It really only takes a tiny bit for really major disasters to happen. So for example, really rigid insistence that our way of loading the dishwasher is the right way and is the only way may get 3 more bowls in the dishwasher, but it actually creates a lot of strain in the relationship. And when it comes to really hard conversations, trying to force someone to agree with us may initially come up with an agreement, but it also breeds bitterness and contempt and resentment in relationships. So we need to actively resist this desire to control other people in our interactions. And we pay attention to what our objective is what our goal is for the interaction. What is it that you hope to achieve during that interaction? What results or changes are you looking for that you want to see happen during or maybe after the interaction? Am I wanting to change their mind, or am I looking for a specific behavior change? What do you hope for in the relationship? What type of relationship do you want with this other person? How do you want them to interact or feel about you, regardless of whether or not you're getting what you're asking for? And how do you want to feel about yourself? What core values do you need to attend to during the interaction? How do you want to feel about yourself, regardless of whether or not you're getting what you want? When it comes to openness, it's asking ourselves, how open am I to considering the possibility that I could be wrong, or maybe I don't have all of the information? Do I have a sense of intellectual humility? Is there a sense of curiosity? Or am I getting information from people who share the same values or the same perspective as me? Am I coming from a place of curiosity, which opens us up to exploring differing perspectives? Or am I stuck in that place where I'm only seeing ways to prove my argument? So I probably, like a lot of you, were into like Netflix, and I watched this Netflix documentary on the Challenger. Highly recommend it. It's really interesting, and it goes over on what accounted for the loss of the space shuttle and their crew member. And they found in this documentary that a key factor of that contributed to that accident was that the culture really discouraged dissent, really discouraged having differing opinions. And when we think about the space shuttle, there really needs to be checks and balances around, especially around safety. So even though the board says effective safety is really required, and it really encourages minority opposition or people coming up with a dissenting view, they found that people actually were more likely to stick together with the same views, and that resists or that pushes against taking another person's perspective, which actually we end up believing more extremely the version of what we already thought before. So people with intellectual humility are both learners, and they're really more effective advocates, because it's really hard for us to craft a moral argument that will resonate with the other person, because it really requires a lot of thought. So it makes sense that it's hard to come up with an argument, especially at Thanksgiving dinner with an uncle, and coming up with this brand new argument, because it's like not something that they've never heard before. So one way we can do that, how we can create intellectual humility, is starting by reading or listening to people who hold a different worldview. So something important to remember, and a word of caution around openness, is that this does not apply when there is a power differential, because research shows that and suggests that it's actually counterproductive to ask someone to bridge differences when they're being discriminated against or otherwise denied power. So in these conversations, you want to clarify your priority. Is it a place of debate, meaning you're trying to change someone's mind or prove a point? Or is it about discussion, which really focuses on understanding and perspective taking? Now, when we say kindness, we have lots of conversations here, that kindness is having these types of conversations that focus on what we have in common. For example, wanting to be good parents or good neighbors, right? Kindness means us treating each other like we'd like to be treated. Kindness recognizes that we're better together and that we have this drive for belonging and connection. But it also means that we stand up against really sometimes powerful others with humility in order to prevent further harm or unethical behavior. It means telling maybe a really good friend a painful truth so that we can help them live more aligned with their values. It means that we're hoping the best for others, and we also acknowledge our own potential for fallibility. But oftentimes, the way we typically approach political persuasion is that we talk about our reasons from our perspective. We hold on to our political positions based off of what's important for us. Rob Weiler is a Stanford University professor, and he does a really good TED Talk too. And he studies the effectiveness of how political arguments are framed. And he argues that if you really want to begin to change someone's mind, then you need to make your argument from the perspective of their values, not your own. And that kind of leads us to this next part, which is really practicing moral reframing, is where we focus on the issue, not the person. And the technique of moral framing is like a position where an individual wouldn't normally support is framed in a way that is consistent with their own moral values. And it can be an effective way to communicate, especially communicate around political persuasion. And the way I understand moral reframing is really kind of taking it from a framework of motivational interviewing strategies. It's where we start where the other person is. And so I want you guys to practice, and in the chat, you can put it in the chat. But I want you to start thinking about some like common issues that are relevant today, like COVID-19, the economy, the Supreme Court, race, and violence in American cities, and really try to frame it with the connection from the other person's perspective and the other person's values. Because we know when they're looking at studies in these moral framings around political ideologies, that we all care about the same thing. It's just how much we care about it is different. And if you're interested in figuring out where you land, yourmorals.com is a really great website where there's Thomas Haight's survey is on there, and it will give you kind of like the frame, and it'll compare you to where you land and where someone would land if they're more liberal or conservative or maybe libertarian. So as you're doing this, it's important to see that, like in a 2013 study by Weiler, he found that conservatives really showed more support for pro-environmental legislation and a greater belief in climate change when they presented that with a purity-based argument. The argument emphasized how dirty or disgusting or impure environmental degradation is. And in a 2015 study, the same group found that liberals were really more supportive of military spending when they presented it from a perspective of fairness-focused arguments, emphasizing military's role in helping overcome inequality or maybe racial discrimination, as opposed to the more notable arguments of American patriotism or world dominance. So as we're having these discussions, it's important to reframe our argument from the perspective of the other, from the values of the other person. And when we look at intergroup work, it's important for us to realize that initiatives that focus on bringing together members of different groups, research has actually shown that they're really less effective at reducing prejudice when groups participating are unequal in power. The dominant group members tend to insist on taking commonalities approach. So like focusing on what we have in common, that we all share the human race, that the race is, is blind or things like that. And then and that comes across as very frustrating and very invalidating for the disadvantaged group, who really most likely want to talk about their differences and the very real experiences of inequalities. So taking the perspective of someone different works to diminish the prejudices of members of the dominant group, but research has shown that it's not really effective for changing stereotypes or attitudes from the disadvantaged group. Actually, research shows that when members of a disadvantaged group are asked to take the perspective of the dominant group, they actually negatively stereotype even more than when they weren't asked to. And that probably comes down to our brain's tendency towards reactions to suppression. If you're interested in learning about brains and our reaction to suppression, or how we have the push towards toxic positivity and looking for the positive, I highly recommend looking at Wegner's work, who's a Harvard professor that studies polar bear and actually does a lot of studies around suppression. It's important also to understand that studies find that intergroup work, when there is a significant power differential, can really undermine the support for social change toward greater equality, especially among disadvantaged group members like ethnic minorities or sexual or gender minorities. And in the references as a link to a Columbia article, and they found in their research and looking at studies, they found that when you have groups where there's an advantage group and a disadvantaged group, they found that the advantage group does feel more connected or reduces stereotypes for the disadvantaged group, but the actual action or movement to make things changes diminishes because they feel like they're doing something, they're hearing perspectives, they feel like they're making changes. Whereas the disadvantaged group ends up finding that there's less motivation for to actually take action towards fighting for reducing equality initiatives. So, and that could be a function of like being frustrated and not actually being heard, or it could be a function of like being heard and like losing motivation to make change. So in order for intergroup work to find a solidarity and moving forward, it's really important that if we're pairing different types of groups, or an advantage group and a disadvantaged group, that we acknowledge the inequalities and express support for taking action and supporting efforts to reduce these inequalities. It's less about having this feeling good about having this conversation and more about focusing on the solutions to make the change. We start with understanding, but then we actually have to take that move towards action. When we have these discussions, the one-on-one conversation is really about understanding and perspective taking, but to actually enact social change, to actually put things in place to make changes, it's really important for us that we're clear about what our values are and shift the focus away from individual debate to organizational and systemic change. It means taking the step from insight into action. It's supporting organizations that are focusing on the systemic issues that align with your own values, and you support them with time or money or expertise. It means thinking critically about the institutions that we align ourselves with and the values that they espouse, to make sure that we're paying attention to the gap between what they say they believe and the actions that they take. And we pay attention to how they're actually living into their values. It means exercising our right to vote, and not just for the president, but for all areas of policy and legislation, including the Senate, the House of Representatives, or even local and state elections. So now I want to see if you guys have any questions, but I really want to pose this. I want you guys to take a step and ask yourself, what's one key takeaway or aha moment that you had today? And what's one thing you commit to putting action into this discovery? So taking your insight and putting action. So if you would like to share in the chat, go ahead and share in the chat. What's one key takeaway and what's one thing you commit to putting your new discovery into action?
And if you want to, if there's anybody who would like to open their line, if you want to raise your hand, I'd love to come on and unmute you for a second so that you could share live as well. You know, one of the things that I really took away from it was some of the breathing techniques, and I really appreciate those. I feel like now more than ever, we just sort of need to take a moment and pause before we go into any of those conversations.
Yes.
And finding new tools to do that is really important, because you can very quickly get to a level 250.
Yeah. Well, I really like those because it speaks to my brain, because I am very like solution focused. My style tends to be more on evidence-based practices, right? But I have a little bit of woo. So I love how it like takes mindfulness and the kind of the wooiness, but also connects it to the neurobiology. So like how our brain actually works, and helps me understand why mindfulness and deep breathing work.
Yeah. A couple other people in the chat box said, yes, they really enjoyed the breathing and prepping, and, you know, honoring people and where they're coming from and different experiences, and making sure that you're intentional about that. The other thing I really appreciate, and I think it's so important, that when we're trying to have these conversations, and particularly persuade people who might be completely on an opposite side of the spectrum or on any issue these days, it's just the idea that we need to start from where they are and really frame it in terms of their values, and understanding that they're different, and the way to have that conversation might be starting from a completely different place than we're at, which is hard.
It is really hard, but the thing that I find a lot of hope in is that as social workers, we're trained in that. Like, we're trained in seeing people from their perspective and putting ourselves in their shoes so that we can understand what it is that they value, and help move and motivate change from that perspective.
Yeah. Alex, I see your hand is raised, so I'm going to go ahead and lower it, but you're also welcome to unmute yourself if we can. Oh, I don't know if we're going to be able to unmute you, Alex. Alex, if you're able to unmute yourself, you can. Perhaps not. That's okay. Is there anyone else who would like to share as we start to wrap up today's conversation? We've got Lauren, who says they really appreciate the rock on and moral reframing as well. I know that was really helpful.
Awesome. Yeah, we got lots of comments in here, and if I don't get a chance to answer your question, you can just post it in there, and I'll circle back and get.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenny says, looking at the other side, they tend to see and get their information out from a different source than I would, and it makes it really hard to talk about the facts. So it's really interesting to think it from that perspective. And I think certainly right now, and particularly around COVID-19, you know, there are a lot of different resources on. Alex, we can hear you. You can unmute yourself if you'd like to speak.
Hello. Oh, you can hear me.
Oh, Alex, there's a ton of feedback. It is just not the day for Zoom and technology.
No, it's not. It's Monday.
Alex, there's a lot of feedback. So if you'd like to chat in the chat box, that might be the better option right now. I'm so sorry. Zoom had an update over the weekend, so I think maybe that's what the issue is for a lot of us. Well, I know that we're wrapping out the 1 o'clock time frame, and I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. I know that people have joined us over a lunch break for this important conversation. Thank you so much. I had a lot of great takeaways today myself, and just found myself a little bit more centered with some new skills and coping techniques as we continue to, work toward the road to November and elections, and also just continuing to deal with this international pandemic, and really challenged with coming together and talking with friends and making sure that they're respectful and navigating them amidst all that's happening. For those of you who are joining today's conversation, we will have it on replay on Facebook. We'll also be uploading it to our NASW-NJ.org website, which will be redirected in just a couple of minutes. We know it's also having a couple of tech glitches today, but you'll be able to find the resources here. You'll be able to share it with your classes, your clients, your friends and family, and we encourage you to do so. Marinelle, thank you so much for joining us and hanging with us through the tech challenges in the very beginning. Wealth of information, really important conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope we all join together in the arena to really make some changes that are in line with our values.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no better time to be a social worker. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think we have a unique skill set that poises us to be able to take this on, not only personally, but certainly to be leaders in the change that we want to see as well.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining us today. And for those who are still interested in this conversation, we'll continue to have community conversations about the road to November, all things election oriented, why it matters, getting out your vote, engaging in the census, all of these conversations critical to what's happening in our world right now. You can stay tuned with our Facebook and our social media accounts, as well as the NASW-NJ.org website. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to more conversations with you.